Going to be talking about imperialism in the Americas. Here are your goals. Let's start with just a quick snapshot of what the Americas looked like around the year 1900. And when I say Americas, I mean the United States and Latin America. I'm not talking about Canada in this video because we've already talked about them as part of the British Empire. But so by 1900, the United States had emerged as a powerful, stable, and industrialized nation, and it had actually emerged as the largest industrial producer in the world at this point, even larger than the major powers of England and Germany over in Europe. On top of this, the United States had constructed a powerful modern navy, and this would allow it to project its power overseas and was a necessary prerequisite for America's emergence as a global imperial power. On top of this, the United States was determined to join in the race for empire. They had sat by and watched Africa be cut apart by the different European nations, and there was a growing clamor among the population of the United States for some kind of American empire. And the reason for this was similar to the reasons for the European imperial expansion. One was the United States felt like it needed new markets for all of the goods it was producing. It also wanted to spread its culture and religion to the rest of the world, sort of the white man's burden idea that we talked about with Rudyard Kipling's poem. And it also desired strategic naval outposts, so little islands all over the world where you could, dock your navy and refuel your navy and stuff like that. So all three of those things led the United States to seek an empire. On the other hand, Latin America was kind of the inverse of what the United States had become. It possessed unstable governments and weak economies. So most of the different nations in Latin America were troubled by frequent civil wars, dictatorships, other problems like that, and they had developed almost no industry. They were still primarily agricultural nations. But Latin America was protected from colonization. It didn't get gobbled up the way Africa was, because both the United States and Britain wanted to keep Latin America independent. And that's because the United States and Britain both realized that they could they could exploit Latin America without directly colonizing them. So they wanted to keep Latin America open to trade and to influence without directly colonizing them. So let's talk for a moment about the United States' emergence as an imperial power. This happens quite suddenly in 1898, when the United States defeats Spain in the Spanish-American War. The war is totally one-sided. The United States basically just crushes the Spanish Navy and is then able to invade and occupy the Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And so by the time the war is over, the United States has acquired 3 overseas colonies: Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean. So as a result, the United States now has a Pacific empire and control of the Caribbean. In the Pacific, besides the Philippines, the United States has also annexed the islands of Hawaii, Guam, and Samoa. And these are important because they provide posts for trans-Pacific shipping, that is for trade with Asia, and also for refueling stations for the U.S. Navy. So if the Navy ever needed to go to Asia, they would have to stop and refuel at these islands. The Caribbean also was now more or less a pond of the United States. The United States controlled this area completely, and even though it didn't take over the other islands, it had significant control over what happened in the region. And so both of these mark the emergence of the United States as a world power. So now that the United States had emerged as an imperial power, it began projecting its control and its influence over Latin America. And it styled itself as the protector of Latin America from imperial designs of other countries. But this is really a fairly questionable role that the United States had taken on. The first thing that established it as the quote-unquote protector of Latin America was the Monroe Doctrine, established all the way back in 1823. And with this declaration, the United States had basically declared that any European nation would be in trouble if they decided to set up a colony in Latin America. The United States declared that colonialism was done in Latin America and that any new colonies would face the hostility of the United States. On top of this, there came the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, and this asserted that the United States was allowed to interfere in the domestic affairs of Latin American countries, supposedly for their own good. But so the two of these together, basically, the message they sent was that Latin America was the place where the United States could intervene, but where nobody else was allowed to. So basically, the United States thought that it should be in control of Latin America. On top of this, the United States began seeking a place to build a canal that would shorten the route between the west coast and the east coast of the United States. Before any canal had been built, to get from New York to San Francisco, you had to sail all the way around the tip of South America, and that took a really long time. And especially now that the United States had emerged as a naval power and had developed a Pacific empire, it needed to be able to travel quickly between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so in order to do this, the United States set out to construct the Panama Canal, and it was begun in 1904 and finished 10 years later. And originally, to get access to Panama in order to build the canal, the United States had tried to buy the region in Panama it needed from Colombia. But Colombia refused. It didn't want to give any of its territory up to the United States. So in order to get this territory, the United States decided to assist an uprising in Panama against Colombia, and then it quickly recognized the rebel Panamanian government. And once it recognized this government, it was then able to buy the rights to the land from the new government. So basically, they helped an uprising in Colombia in order to get what they wanted. And then they were able to build the canal. Other types of intervention in Latin American countries like this would continue on for a long time. One of the most notorious series of engagements is something called the Banana Wars, and basically this is just when the United States would intervene in Caribbean or Central American countries in order to protect the welfare of American businesses. So if there was an uprising that threatened the stability of a region, that maybe threatened the investments of American companies, the United States would send in an army, settle things down, and establish a new government friendly to U.S. business. The bottom line here is that the United States basically did whatever it wanted to in the region in order to further its own interests. The other major player in Latin America besides the United States was Great Britain. And the role played by Great Britain took two forms. In some places, it took the form of formal imperialism, where the British directly controlled a territory. And this happened in the places like Jamaica, Guyana, and Belize. But more importantly, the British engaged in a type of informal empire in which they controlled the area without officially taking it over. And the reason informal empire was so important for Britain in this region is that it was impossible to extend their formal empire into Latin America because of the Monroe Doctrine. What that said, again, is that if Britain tried to set up new colonies in the area, the United States would see that as an attack and might even declare war against Great Britain. But so instead of directly taking over regions, what Britain does is They make sure nobody else colonizes the area by protecting its independence and establishing the principle of free trade. And then they go ahead and control the region economically. And how this works is the British would give lots and lots of monies to Latin America in order to shape the economies of the Latin American countries in order to suit their own interests. So, for example, the British in the South American country of Argentina invested a whole bunch of money in order to make sure that Argentina would become a beef-producing nation that would export this stuff to Great Britain, rather than an industrialized nation that would compete with Great Britain. And it would repeat this strategy in other countries as well. And as a result of indirect imperialism, many of the wealthy elite in different Latin American countries grew to depend on British business. And so there was a sort of informal alliance between the ruling elites in Latin America and Great Britain. And the bottom line here is that the British, with their economic influence, were able to turn Latin America into an unofficial part of the British Empire by transforming the economies in whatever way they needed. And so just to sum up the basic points of this video, Latin America avoided being directly colonized by industrial powers. And this was thanks both to the United States and to Great Britain. But it became a part of the informal empires of the United States and Britain. And it did the same job as normal colonies. It supplied raw materials and agricultural products to these industrialized nations, especially stuff like sugar, coffee, bananas, and beef. And it also provided a market for manufactured goods, so the United States and Britain could sell stuff to Latin America. And the United States was not afraid to intervene in the region in order to preserve this semi-colonial status. Anytime there was any sort of disruption to the status quo, the United States would go in and reestablish order and make sure its business interests were protected. So that is sort of what was going on in the Americas in the age of imperialism.